Hello, and welcome to this 48th episode in my series titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name's Michael Dwan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and life coach in private practice in London. In this video, I'll talk about pathology. I'll describe an integral understanding of what it is, how it's been deconstructed and misunderstood by postmodernism and critical social justice ideology, and why and how we need to reconstruct what it means so that we're better equipped to address it when and where it occurs. I'll warn you, this isn't going to be easy, but stick with me. If you aren't familiar with an integral perspective, you may never view pathology in the same way again after hearing what I have to say. And if you have intuitions that the woke tend to normalize too many things that ought to be considered unhealthy, and that sometimes they place blame for suffering in the wrong place, you'll have a robust way to think about this. This is important because if we don't have a sophisticated way to recognize the complexity of what stands in the way of the thriving of individuals and our collective life, we won't be prepared to take effective action when well-being is under threat. Before offering an integral perspective on pathology, I want to address its deconstruction by critical social justice as informed by postmodernism and critical theory. From that perspective, the idea of pathology is just another list of one of the social constructions that critical social justice takes aim at for its oppressive function. I will shortly argue that that is an inadequate view. That said, let's give postmodernism its due for questioning inaccurate and unhelpful diagnoses of pathology. Perhaps the most noteworthy and familiar is the declassification of homosexuality as a mental illness or psychopathology. Homosexuality represents nonconformity to the social norm of heterosexuality, but that doesn't make it pathological. Why this is so will be clear later in my description of an integral reconstruction of pathology. Consider also the relatively new idea of neurodivergence, which reclassifies what have been considered mental health issues in the past as simply different ways of being. Examples include autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and Tourette's. Beyond these, there has also been some movement to include the following as neurodivergent instead of pathological: obsessive-compulsive disorder, borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and more recently, gender dysphoria. These are just a few examples. I don't have time to address each of these individually. That would take hours. What I want to point out is that while each of these items on these two lists do technically represent neurodivergence, that doesn't mean they are therefore categorically not pathological. It depends on how severely these things show up in people's lives and to what degree they can compromise their functioning and ability to form meaningful social connections. The postmodern examination of these diagnoses as social constructions is useful toward checking our assumptions and automatically locating pathology within individuals based on their non-compliance with social norms. Sometimes pathology is the product of a poor fit between an individual and an unaccommodating social world. For instance, many have pointed out that ADHD is the product of putting children, especially boys, in environments where they are expected to sit still and focus on written words for hours every day. For adults, it may be that the demands of life and work require capacities that are routinely eroded by the rapid-fire assaults made on our attention by the digital world, and we may have become addicted to it. The point is that a social context is required, and that can be a primary contributor to any problems that develop. This has been well described by the social model of disabilities. It may also be true that there are useful capacities and gifts within many of the differences that we have diagnosed as pathological, gifts not recognized and appreciated by a culture that does not value what these different ways of being have to offer. So, thanks to postmodernism for getting us to examine these things. But I've seen all of these diagnoses up close in my work as a therapist over the past 44 years. I've seen them expressed in minor, moderate, and severe ways. I became convinced that we can't explain all of these things away as merely the consequences of social constructions that impose toxic categories and expectations on people. As a young man, I felt very critical, hostile even, toward the professional tendency to pathologize people. I was on board with Michel Foucault's analysis of mental illness presented in his book, Madness and Civilization, and Thomas Saz's The Manufacture of Madness gave more weight to my argument against pathologizing. However, after 8 years of working in acute psychiatric hospitals, I was willing to concede that not every person with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or borderline personality disorder, for instance, was merely undergoing a spiritual emergency, or that their special gifts were not sufficiently appreciated. No, something was seriously wrong. It was not at all obvious that their troubles were the result of a pathological social failure to accommodate their current behaviors. Very often, but not always, these people had adverse childhood experiences that wounded them in ways that resulted in mental illness. So they weren't inherently pathological, but the symptoms they suffered were not just a different and equally healthy way to be in the world. Clearly, in my mind, the psychiatric hospital was deeply inadequate and problematic in terms of providing a truly therapeutic and healing treatment. But it hadn't caused the problem in the first place. It was just the crude biomedical model doing what it thought was right, given its own limited conceptions of pathology, that sometimes, sadly, made it worse. Here's my point. The deconstruction of pathology has been useful, but it has gone too far. By refusing to recognize pathology as a real problem, and by placing all blame for its appearance on the injustices caused by social constructs, including the construct of pathology itself, it cripples our ability to describe, locate, and respond to it effectively. If you're liking this video so far, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, click the bell for notifications, leave me a comment, and share it with a friend. This will help my channel grow, and I'll greatly appreciate it. Thanks. Now back to our topic. Okay. Now let's see what integral theory contributes to a more holistic conception of pathology. To provide an integral way to reconstruct the idea of pathology, I'll rely on just two primary integral concepts: holons and quadrants. I'll need to explain both before we can consider them in terms of pathology. So let's first talk about holons. The word holon was first coined by Arthur Koestler in his 1967 book, The Ghost in the Machine. Much later, Ken Wilber explored and described this in his 1995 book, Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. The word holon is a combination of the Greek words holos, meaning whole, and on, meaning part. So, essentially, a holon is a whole that is composed of parts and which itself is part of a larger whole. I guess it needs to be said that there is nothing that isn't a holon. All things are holons, including human beings. An individual person is whole in themselves, is composed of parts, including organs, cells, molecules, and atoms, and is part of larger wholes like families, communities, ecosystems, nations, the solar system, and so on. The other integral concept is quadrants. These are the four dimensions of all holons, or four perspectives we can take when trying to understand them. They are derived from the recognition that all holons have an individual, a collective, an interior, and an exterior dimension. I'll put up a graphic to illustrate this. When you put individual and collective on a vertical axis and interior and exterior on a horizontal axis, you get the following: the individual interior, the individual exterior, the collective interior, and the collective exterior. To make this more straightforward, I prefer to use the words mind, body, relationships, and environment. The mind is the individual's interior subjective experience of thoughts, feelings, sensations, dreams, etc. Body refers to the individual's physical body, which includes everything it is made up of, as well as its behavior. Relationships revert to intersubjective experience, which includes everything experienced in relationships. This could be with one other person, a family, friend group, community, and all the way up to one's whole culture. It's the zone of shared meaning, This is where social constructs come into play. Environment is about the physical infrastructure of society. This includes transportation, housing, industry, communication, medicine, education, economics, and so forth. Just as the individual body includes its behavior, the exterior collective includes not only static physical infrastructure, but also how it moves and how human behavior is regulated within its institutions. With a basic understanding of holons and quadrants, let's now consider pathology. I offer the following integrally oriented definition. Pathology is the breakdown and dysfunction of holons. There are three primary ways that a holon becomes pathological. One, its parts are structurally breaking down and fail to function in service to the integrity of the whole. Two, it behaves in ways that don't integrate and meet the needs of its constituent parts. Three, the larger holon in which it is embedded does not integrate it and meet its needs. As just suggested, a breakdown or a dysfunction at any of these three holonic levels will have consequences for the other levels. A quick example to illustrate this when it comes to human holons. Let's say some world leader develops an illness. Their biological parts are breaking down and not functioning properly. This has an impact on their general well-being and functioning as a person. This may compromise their decision-making in ways that impact a nation or even the world. Or let's say social conditions are extremely stressful and even traumatic. This will impact on an individual's feeling of well-being, which may lead to illness and behaving in ways that then impact their family and community. The point is that while we may be able to identify where the trouble begins, maybe, it is not where it ends. Pathology reverberates throughout a holonic system. So this holonic definition of pathology suggests that its causes and effects can be observed at different levels in the holonic hierarchy, and that these causes and effects reverberate through the system. A person can be sick because of something happening inside their body, perhaps genetically predisposed to happen. That may be the original cause and location of the pathology, but the person themselves becomes ill. But the cause could also originate with the whole person who chooses to behave in a way that causes pathology in the parts of their biological system. Notice also that sometimes it is the greater social world that fails to provide what the individual needs. This then might be considered the original location or cause of the pathology, which then impacts the individual and all the parts that make them up. I know I've said this a couple times, I'm just trying to get it across. This is complex enough, and we haven't even gotten to quadrants yet. Just in terms of the nested hierarchies of holons, precisely isolating the location of the original cause of a pathology with any certainty can be near impossible. Is it some breakdown of biological systems caused strictly internally, or did the individual's lifestyle choices cause it? Or we could ask, are an individual's lifestyle choices the product of a social reality that pushed the individual in that direction? And considering the social collective as a whole on itself, it not only has responsibility for the well-being of its parts, both individuals and groups, but itself can become pathological when its parts are not taken care of and integrated within the whole. Furthermore, this then also suggests that individuals and groups have some responsibility for the well-being of the whole, which sustains them, just as organ systems have responsibility for keeping the body alive. When individuals and groups disidentify and dissociate from the larger collective, they both cut themselves off from its sustenance and represent a pathology within that larger system. It may happen that disidentification and dissociation occur due to a failure of the social holon to support and integrate certain groups. In this case, part of the solution is to rectify this. But if the individual or group is unwilling to identify with the social holon and find a place within it and a way to contribute something of value to the whole, then pathology will persist. It's not always the fault of the collective. The causes and effects of pathology are multiple. Saying where pathology originates is like answering the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be widely understood, and instead there is a tendency for people to have their own preferred explanations. For instance, mental illness is caused biologically and is best treated with psychotropic medications, or mental illness is caused by poor individual choices and individuals need to make cognitive and behavioral changes, or mental illness is the product of living in an insane world and is itself a mere social construct, and we need to overturn all such oppressive social forces. Okay, finally, let's talk about quadrants. Just as holonic levels are interpenetrating, so are the quadrants. In fact, quadrants are only a heuristic device that allows us to take different perspectives on an undivided thing that provides no lines for demarking these perspectives being separate things. When it comes to body, the exterior biological dimension of individuals, the idea of pathology can seem straightforward. Everybody has gotten physically sick and taken medicine. On this basic level, the idea of pathology is unproblematic. But what about pathological mind? If we can't find some pathology in the brain, how are we to understand psychopathology? Just as the body is composed of parts that are integrated within and function in service to the body, so the mind is composed of parts that need to be integrated and function in service to the self, that whole that gives us a sense of identity and agency. The mind makes sense of the world, orients us to where we are, what matters and what it is we ought to do. The mind has its own hierarchy of parts. We have perceptions, concrete representations, abstractions, systems of abstractions, and principles, each of which are built with, transcend and include the parts that preceded them. When the parts of the mind break down and become incoherent in ways that fail to serve the needs of the self, then there's pathology. When the self is compromised to the extent that it is unable to navigate the social world and find a way to be a part of the larger social holon and make a meaningful contribution, this also represents pathology at that level. Or maybe the mind does well in solving practical issues for personal survival, but the interior collective quadrant, or relationships, is not well put together in terms of communication skills, attachment style, conflict resolution, assertiveness, and so forth. There's a breakdown in the relationship quadrant, and social functioning is impaired. Or maybe a pathology shows up in terms of a person's relationship with their physical environment. Hoarding, agoraphobia, and isolation, not attending to safety concerns, hygiene or sanitation, dissociation from natural environments. Why might these things be pathological? Because they tend to compromise one's health, well-being, and connection with the larger world. My point is that pathology can be recognized in each quadrant, and when it is identified in a particular quadrant, inevitably it will also express itself in the others to some degree. An illness that originates in the body will have an impact on the mind in terms of anxiety and mood and possibly mental clarity. It may have an impact on one's relationships or ability to go to work. It might result in one neglecting one's environment. As a thought experiment, pick anything else that could be considered a pathology and start in just one quadrant. It's easy to imagine how it will also show up in terms relevant to the other quadrants. And if the pathology is first located in the larger social holon, we can see that its repercussions will affect an individual in all four quadrants. A toxic work environment could cause anxiety and depression, mind. This can have an effect on primary relationships, like partners and families. Preoccupations with work worries may cause one to neglect one's home environment, which then becomes another source of stress. All of this might weaken one's immune system and lead to a physical illness. I'm only trying to make the most general sketch of how the integral idea of holons and quadrants can give us a way to think about pathology. The implications and permutations are myriad and can quickly begin to feel overwhelming. Maybe this accounts for why it's so tempting to reduce everything to one simple explanation. But this isn't good enough. I think we need to take a multidisciplinary approach to pathology. We need to learn all we can about how holons work, from cells to individuals to groups to ecosystems, and get better at identifying what causes them to break down and fail to function in different quadrants and at different holonic levels. If we can do this, we will be better in a better position to solve problems and remedy pathologies holistically and systemically, and therefore more effectively. As I said earlier, this integral reconstruction of pathology does not exclude the insights of postmodernism and critical theory, or the perspectives of critical social justice. It includes them. This is in keeping with the basic tenet of integral theory that says development is a process of transcending and including. In this case, critical social justice is not wrong. It is simply partially right. It is only wrong when it claims to be the whole truth. As for psychotherapy, I think it's important for therapists to remember that they are working with individuals, with the exception of couples, families, and group work. Our concern should be at the holonic level that we are paid and prepared to address. We should be focused on individual pathology, or if you prefer a different word, then use that word instead. We're addressing problems, dysfunctions, distress, suffering, and longing at the level of the individual. We can be aware of how social context may contribute to individual suffering due to pathology at that level, but we're not treating that level. While it needs to be done, it's not our job to heal society. We ought to help facilitate our clients' ability to be good stewards of their own parts in all four quadrants and find a meaningful place in the larger world where they can integrate what they have to offer with what the larger social holon needs. In the end, this may help society more than anything else. Therapists might validate their clients' critical views of the society they are a part of and empathize with any way that they suffer because of it. However, I think fostering resentment toward and dissociation from the social holon and neglecting personal responsibility is not helpful. Here, I mean responsibility for one's own well-being, being a good steward that takes care of its own parts. But I also mean responsibility to find a place and a role within the larger social holon and make a meaningful contribution to the best of one's ability, and not simply be a consumer of resources and a complainer. In fact, I believe that when therapists emphasize the toxicity and inadequacy of the social holon and do not address individual pathology and responsibility, it can be quite harmful. It isn't good for the individual, and at scale, it fosters societal pathology. It's like feeding a cancer that eventually kills the body, but also the cancer along with it. Or as Norm MacDonald once said, no one loses the battle with cancer. At best, you have to call it a draw. I think we can do better than that. I've only been able to offer a very broad sketch here of an integral reconstruction of pathology. I hope that it's been enough to get you to thinking, asking questions, imagining implications, and noticing examples in your everyday life. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. I always say this at the end of my videos, and it occurs to me now that this is the simplest way to suggest what to do about everything I have just said in this video. Bye for now.